Hi, I'm Gal Pastor. Welcome to my channel. I try to gear my videos to correspond to the Christian calendar. And come end of October this year, I have a dilemma. Day of the Dead versus the Reformation Day. The Day of the Dead won. So in the next several videos, I'm going to be talking about grief and mourning by unpacking the multifaceted biblical rituals connected to grief. The Bible repeatedly mentions these ways of expressing sorrow and pain of loss or of anticipated tragedy: tearing of one's clothes, putting on a sackcloth, pouring ashes over one's head and body, shaving the head or disheveling hair, hiding one's face with a hand or with a cloth, lamenting, beating of the breasts, and abstaining from food. In Leviticus, the practice of hurting oneself is expressly forbidden. Do not cut your bodies for the dead, the verse says. As a former pastor and a chaplain, I am an observer of grief, and I have a certain tolerance for absorbing high-intensity grief, which is what is essential. That tolerance is really needed in those professions. I have observed grief in many forms, from mild, almost unnoticeable outward reaction to the onset of inward pain in the aftermath of death, to dramatically expressive outworkings such as loud lament, breast beating, or just general reaction or response of the limbs, like the occurrences when people would punch or kick a hole or holes in the walls of the emergency room, or even throw furniture into the wall. Most of the grief expressions we're going to unpack are somewhat foreign to us in our Western culture. When they are mentioned in the Bible, not much more explanation is given with them. Those watching the mourning happening in real time would know exactly what that display was and its meaning, but for us who received these stories without broader cultural or religious context, we have to poke and prod and interpret with humility, but we start with seeking common ground, which is grief and pain, still unchanged human emotions that develop in our bodies at the onset of great loss. What we're interested in here is the expression, the outward form that the inner overwhelming emotional pain takes in this, our physical world. My starting presupposition is that the outward expression is not merely for public benefit. All these forms of grieving that I listed are not just a dramatic performance for the onlookers so that those around you would be up to date with what's happening. I'm going to assume instead that there is also a personal outlet taking place, that the expression has a real function, moreover, that it is for the sake of the mourner's eventual overall well-being that the inner pain is given a visible or audible appearance. I'm also going to suggest that by dressing the pain in a ritual, representing its different elements in a symbolic action, that in that expression, God would meet them and consecrate them. Today, we're going to dissect the ritual of rendering or tearing of one's clothes and sort of lay the groundwork for all the other expressions that will follow in my upcoming videos. When I start looking for a common ground, I note that for me, altering one's clothing in grief does resonate. I come from a culture that observes the custom of wearing exclusively black clothing after the death of a close family member. Even though I wasn't living in Croatia, I wore black clothing for a year after my mom's death and for 6 months after my dad died several years later. My sisters were doing that at home in Croatia, and I wanted to express my solidarity with them so that all 3 daughters would be mourning together. And also, I wanted to have a visible expression of my altered state of life in the aftermath of such significant deaths. Having a limited assortment of dress choices every morning was a daily reminder of that. It was also a posthumous love letter of a sort to my mom, signifying that she mattered so much. When my mom died, my son was only 7 months old, which meant I wore black for the following year of his life. It was a stark contrast to the joy that had been brought into our immediate American household by his presence. All those many meanings were symbolized by my altered clothing and appearance. The first two mentions of someone tearing their own garments are in Genesis. They are connected to Joseph's fate. Both Reuben and his father Jacob tear their respective clothing when they believe that Joseph had died. When Reuben returns to the cistern and sees that Joseph is not there, he tears his clothes, as he becomes convinced that his plan to save the boy had been foiled. The action not only expressed his sorrow, but also his culpability. As the oldest brother, he had a responsibility to prevent fratricide. When Joseph's colorful robe is then presented to his father, Jacob exclaims, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob responds with multiple rituals, tearing his clothing, putting on a sackcloth, and mourning for his son for many days. He refuses to be comforted, saying, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." Not an exaggerated, hyperbolic statement, but the reality of every parent's emotion in that situation. I'm wondering whether the coat itself had some tears in it that made Jacob conclude that Joseph was torn by animals. Perhaps the first recorded biblical ritual of rendering of one's clothing is connected to Joseph's imagined tearing, the conclusion possibly reached because of his torn, colorful robe. The ritual is perhaps then representative, and the symbolism is connected to the mode of dying. David is said to have torn his clothing after learning of Saul's and Jonathan's passing, as well as when the report came that Absalom killed all the king's sons. The king stood up, tore his clothes, and he seemingly prostrated himself on the ground, and his attendants, those around him, also tore their clothes. Were they expected to imitate the leader, or did they themselves experience the onset of sorrow as well? But here we observe that the entire community joined in mourning in the same manner. They are all in torn clothes. David's daughter, Tamar, tore her royal long robe with sleeves, wept, and put ashes on her head when her half-brother Amnon ignored her plea to offer restitution to her after he raped her. Her sorrow perhaps can be dissected into particular parts: violent loss of bodily autonomy, the hope of marriage destroyed, and much anguish about her uncertain future. By tearing her robes, she also sort of foreshadows the disintegration, the tearing of David's family, the tearing of that entire community. Elisha, when Elijah was taken up into heaven, tore his garments. Even though this was not your typical death, the anguish of separation from someone that he called father was so strong that Elisha expressed it by rendering his garments. Job, when his entire family died, tore his robe and shaved his head. Then we are told he fell to the ground in worship. Here the expression of sorrow is connected to spirituality. The same with Hezekiah, who went into the house of God with his torn clothes in order to assume a prayerful posture. When Jephthah learned what was going to be the outcome of his rash vow, when his only child came out to meet him, he tore his clothes and cried. Here the emotions are the anguished anticipation of what was to happen next, and of course devastating regret. Another example of anticipation of a tragic outcome or reaction when receiving disastrous news is Mordecai when he learned of Haman's plot to destroy the Jews in Esther. And here we have a whole assortment of mourning practices, sort of preemptively. He tore his clothes, put on a sackcloth and ashes, and went into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. Now, as we have seen, some of these instances are not directly connected to death, but other tragedies. The practice of tearing of one's clothing is not solely reserved for grief either. When in Leviticus, persons who have leprosy are required to wear torn clothes and disheveled hair. The response to blasphemy in both Old Testament and New involves rendering of clothes, as well as repentance does. There are two instances in the Bible when the tearing of the clothing is forbidden. Leviticus forbids the high priests to tear their vestments and dishevel their hair in mourning because of their cultic status. Moses forbids Aaron and his sons to do the same ritual when Nadab and Abihu die because they offered unholy fire to the Lord, as if mourning them in such manner would clash with their spiritual standing before the Lord. As I was thinking about other fabrics that were torn in the Bible, it occurred to me to entertain this idea that the tearing of the temple curtain was the momentary demonstration of the intensity of God's grief and pain over Christ's death. I know this is speculative because, of course, the traditional interpretation is that the tear opened up the inner sanctuary, thus symbolizing access to God. But after thinking about this biblical ritual of spontaneous pain expression, doesn't the tearing of the curtain in God's dwelling place look and sound a bit different to you? Just a thought. By and large, the tearing of one's clothes in the Bible was a powerful expression of grief. Why clothes? What do clothes represent? What's the significance of the destruction of clothes? Apart from status, clothing, of course, on the basic level is used for warmth, but it also functions to facilitate modesty. I want us to note how the tearing of the clothing affects every single level of that functioning. Clothes were then so much more expensive than they are in our experience, especially with the wretched fast fashion. Some were made of expensive material with costly energy, and so were considered part of the precious personal property. Clothing was so highly prized to be taken as booty in battle, and we know that some people of high status, like kings, even had guards or keepers of their wardrobe. How exactly are the clothes rendered? Once in the Old Testament we are told that the clothes are torn into numerous pieces. Once, in the case of Elisha, we are told that his garments were torn in precisely 2 pieces. All other instances do not specify how many tears are resulting when the verb to render is used. There were many extra-biblical Jewish laws written about this practice, and some of these continue in today's Jewish life. I don't want to move from the biblical narrative except to note that some Jewish traditions indicate that the person mourning must tear the clothing over the heart, therefore exposing the heart as an important sign of its broken condition. Whether or not that is in continuity with the biblical witness, we do not know. The Old Testament term for clothing or covering is beged, and it can have both singular and plural form. When clothing is torn, in all but one case, the plural is used, suggesting that more than one garment would be torn in this mourning ritual. Many of the instances of tearing are followed by the putting on of a sackcloth, which might suggest that not only the expensive garments were sacrificed in the tearing, but modesty and warmth were as well, One would be standing presumably publicly in need of another covering and somewhat chilly. Two writers have put the resulting effect into these words. When one rends one's clothes, one strips oneself of all these different aspects of the significance of clothing in human life. There seems to be a voluntary and spontaneous self-humiliation associated with tearing of one's garments, and to some extent dehumanization. That which is fundamental to human is adversely affected. The verb to tear or render does signify a violent and aggressive action, and I think we feel that in all these instances. We feel that it is an immediate, visceral, momentary response reaction. There has to be a strong emotion to accomplish the rendering, assuming these are quality garments. What emotions fuel the tear? You name it. Fear, despair, deep anguish and grief, anger, disbelief, rejection of the finality, and strong regret, perhaps. As I'm talking about this, perhaps all along you are screaming a verse at me from the prophet Joel. Rend your hearts and not your garments. No question, empty external rituals are condemned as worthless. The corrective to have the heart be the source of the outward behaviors, of course, was needed. But I think this argument is valid when rendering of the clothes symbolizes repentance rather than grief of loss. When it comes to mourning practices, if I'm hearing anything in these biblical stories, it is the permission to indeed show the intensity of the inner turmoil in some sort of outward demonstration. I think the integration of both, internal and external, is the point and the goal. What if we gave these biblical accounts the benefit of the doubt and presumed that with the rich meaning and symbolism, they also packed some wisdom in these rituals? What do we do with all this? Like most of these rituals of mourning in the Bible, the rendering of one's clothes results in drastic modification of outward appearance. Do you want to symbolize or manifest your inner brokenness by your drastically altered appearance, comfort, and status? Would that be in any way helpful? I'm afraid this is as far as I go with you, unpacking a seemingly simple reaction to uncover all these elements underneath it. The rest of the way you go alone. How would you design your own ritual that is packed with meaning for you? Can you imagine your neighborhood, your grocery store, seeing people in ripped clothes and immediately understanding in your mind and your heart that their lives are broken with sorrow? Do you want your heart to be showing to every stranger you see, or do we keep this for the inner intimate circle only? What do you think? Perhaps we would destroy our most precious clothing item because we don't consider tearing things as such a huge financial sacrifice. Perhaps if we visit our loved ones' graves on the Day of the Dead, we would go in torn clothes or have a symbolic ritual right there. I'm going to finish with highlighting again my presupposition from the start that these rituals are good and beneficial. When we are experiencing overwhelming emotions of grief and sorrow, our whole entire being has a need to express the pain that the inside, heart and mind are tormented with. Whatever shape your ritual takes, its aim should be a holistic expression, so that the interaction of emotions, thoughts, body, our social and familial relationships, and our spirituality, our connection with God, would be as unified as possible. And I think that the biblical accounts indicate that the practice of such holistic rituals eventually helps us to continue living and worshiping.